said you normally have. Caroline said you normally have slides. Is that right? So
yes, we do.
I have done it with slides, but we'll. Some of the issues are so live that I guess some of the questions you might have at the end aren't going to be covered by the slides. But so I thought I'd give you just a very brief sort of update on what we've been doing in the vaccine work in Southampton. And apologies if some of you have seen some of these slides in any of the updates that I've done for the trust or the university over the last few months. So everybody's an expert at coronavirus vaccines and coronavirus now, right? So what we're trying to do with a vaccine is stimulate an immune response that mimics the virus response itself and provides some memory to the immune system. So the coronavirus gets into cells, and then the virus enters the cell, and then an immune response happens through T and B cells, and we produce antibodies and cells that then remember the coronavirus and respond to future infection, even when the antibody levels have fallen over time. And that's important, especially when we start to think about the variant vaccines and the boosters. So with any of the new vaccines, and everybody's talking about vaccines now as if we've always had them, but it was only in the 3rd week of November last year that we even realized that we would be able to make a coronavirus vaccine that worked, that protected us when the first results came in. But for all of the vaccines, we need to monitor safety. We need to work out whether they make immune responses, whether those immune responses protect against infection, which is not the same thing. How long do the protection last? Do the different technologies work best on their own or combined in sequence? And will boosters be needed? And if so, how often? So the Vaccine Task Force, which is part of BEIS, Department of Business, working with Department of Health, purchased 4 or 5 different types of COVID vaccine to ensure supply, and just in case some didn't work very well. And these are all the different vaccines that VTF decided to pursue, some of which have fallen by the wayside, the grayed out ones, although GSK Sanofi have now reformulated and coming back with their vaccine and as a variant vaccine as well. They just had got their dose wrong in their original trials. So within the National Institute of Health Research, the network developed from vaccine delivery. At first, we in Southampton joined up with Oxford. We were the first site outside Oxford to join them for their phase 1 trial. But very rapidly, that became a network of 17 sites. And then when the other Vaccine Task Force trials looked as if they were going to be coming online, very quickly within NIHR, we had to get a network together to basically allow mass enrollment across regions, across the whole country, in order to secure the vaccine contracts. Because one of the things that's been airbrushed out of history over the last few months is that it wasn't just VTF signing business contracts. They were signing contracts that said that NIHR would deliver the phase 3 trials in return for the contracts, which would then have the money for the trials taken off the final bill of the vaccines that were supplied to the UK. So the ability of us in the UK to do this large-scale recruitment was from the beginning part of the plan as to how VTF could secure the contracts and get ahead of the game, as they did successfully. But it wasn't just a business transaction, and it certainly wasn't anything to do with the politicians. So this national network has had research coordination, training of staff, physical location and logistics. We were given locations by the NHS, by the integrated care systems, both in Hampshire and in Dorset. And we now have within Wessex 3 locations at Southampton, Royal Southampton, Bournemouth Hospital and Portsmouth now to be able to do the vaccine trials. We've had to have 24-hour on call for the participants who are in trials. And for the Oxford trial and all the other phase 3s, we actively monitored the subjects for infection. The Oxford trial also was swabbing people every week, self-swabbing to try and work out transmission. It was the only phase 3 study that looked at transmission. So where we were in April and trying to understand the data, which I've updated with a line at the bottom there, and where we are now really is that all the vaccines prevent hospitalization and death, and we can't compare the trial data directly. This caused huge confusion at the beginning of the year with headline immunities of 65 and 95%. And it was clear that all the trials were done slightly differently and with different definitions, and also the technologies work in different ways. So the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Janssen vaccine are viral vector vaccines which build immunity with increasing interval between doses. But now we've moved on a bit and we're beginning to understand how the vaccines work against variants. And we understand now that actually we probably need 2 doses to be able to give people that cross protection against the different variants that are now circulating compared to 6 months ago. Originally it was the Wuhan strain, and then the Kent strain, and then now the Indian strain or Delta in the UK. But we're beginning to understand how the vaccines work against variants, and we know there's 2 things we can do. We can either increase people's antibody levels, and that seems to give us some cross protection, so we can use vaccines from the original strain and increase the antibody level to protect against variants, though also it will have some T-cell memory response. And we can also think about whether we change the vaccines themselves. And we're starting to do trials now with the variant vaccines. The problem with changing the vaccines is that there is a phenomenon called original antigenic sin, which basically means that the immune system remembers the pattern of the antigen or the virus or the vaccine that it sees first. And so changing the vaccine might actually make the immune system worse. It can make it better, but it might make the immune response worse against the variant strain itself. We have to try that in a clinical trial. And the other thing is, if we change the vaccine in one direction and then there's a new variant that goes off in the other direction, then we might be worse off than just using the original strains and raising the antibodies. So the trials we're doing now and the work we're all doing now is really to build our knowledge and our library of knowledge in order to be able to make decisions down the line. And when the press asks me and other people questions at the moment, it really is a genuine answer. We just don't know. We have to do the trials, wait and see what happens, and then make the best informed decisions that we can through the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, and trust them to make those decisions as they get to see data from all sorts of sources, including the companies and public sector trials, out with what's in the public domain. So lots of work still to do. So the main controversy at the beginning of the year was the very scientific decision to change to 12 weeks from 4 weeks in order to get more first doses into people at the time and take the pressure off the NHS. That was completely vindicated in retrospect. I think probably wasn't communicated between Christmas and the New Year particularly effectively, either by the scientists. There seemed to be my colleague Adam Finn as the lone person in the press talking about it, rather than an explanation of the science and then a decision. And that caused chaos globally, as lots of people queued up to criticize what turned out to be a very correct decision. And it wasn't a guess, it wasn't just lucky. JCVI had access to the data and made their decision based on what they knew about vaccines, non-coronavirus and coronavirus vaccines at that time. Clearly, public confidence has been one of the hugely surprising things in the UK, because everybody was waiting for this wave of hesitancy, and it hasn't happened because the press have behaved pretty responsibly, and the MHRA have been really open about the way they discuss the results and the side effects and so on. Actually, the public are accepting the vaccines, and apart from a few pockets, such as some of the areas of very, very high deprivation and some of the BAME community where there's a lot of work to do, actually most people are accepting the pandemic vaccines to protect themselves and others. Even the young people have realized this is the way for society to go back to normal. And the media, apart from The Guardian actually, which is very disappointing, and they're continually being a bit negative, the media is being incredibly responsible in their reporting. And of course, the media can help by not focusing on that hesitancy. And somehow we've got as a community to work out how to get to the pockets of communities who are not looking at mainstream media, and who many of us find we're not talking to. We know we're not talking to communities who don't have English as their foreign language, who are seeing social media misinformation from many global sources. So the other thing that's quite controversial, that there is no right answer to other than compulsion is likely to be detrimental, is whether we should be forcing people to have vaccines. Not in the general public. I don't think anybody's ever going to say to the general public, you have to have a vaccine to do X or Y, but actually social care, you now have to have a vaccine to go to work. And there are many arguments for doing, many people think that should be the case in healthcare. Lots of people say, well, that's just going to make hesitancy worse, and the people who are anti-vaccine. It's actually really complicated. NHS staff don't have any problem having a hepatitis vaccine before they start working in the NHS, and it is a mystery to me and others, and probably to you, as to why there seems to be such a controversy about annual flu vaccine or now coronavirus vaccine. So I'm sure that will play out, but it's more of a political issue rather than a medical one. And of course, foreign travel. People are finding that they have to have the vaccines to be able to go abroad. It's got nothing to do with the UK government. So we'll come back to that in relation to the trials in a bit. So in terms of vaccine effectiveness, there's lots of real world data. The most encouraging that came through in March was that for one dose of either vaccine deployed in people with a median age of over 85, a Bristol study showed almost identical effectiveness in the real world of one dose of Pfizer or Oxford AstraZeneca. And that for people of such an elderly age was an amazing amazing real world effect of the coronavirus vaccines. And there's lots more real world evidence now, lots of studies coming out almost every day. Big public sector studies in the UK, Siren and the hosted data set. I won't go through the detail now, but basically showing the effectiveness of vaccines and preventing symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission, and the ability to transmit, but not 100% protective about ability to transmit, but significantly reducing people's ability to transmit the condition, even when you're asymptomatic. Of course, there have been very rare side effects. Interesting how the press has picked on them differently. Extremely rare blood clots seen in AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines when deployed to millions of people. So rare they would never have been detected in clinical trials. And we still don't know fully whether this is to do with the vaccine type or antibodies to the spike protein or something else, because all of the vaccines picked a slightly different sequence to target their vaccines against. And of course, we now have an extremely rare myocarditis in young people with the mRNA vaccine for Pfizer, and it's not yet clear whether that's for Moderna as well. And so, and that has not captured the public's headlines or the media's headlines nearly as much as the AstraZeneca and Janssen problems, but it might happen in almost as many people to a greater or less extent, albeit incredibly rare. So we need active surveillance for all new medicines and vaccines, and we are certain in the UK that the MHRA have an excellent system, our yellow card system, and the active surveillance of the clots that the haematologists have put in place is actually very comprehensive. So what are we doing now? What's needed now? Well, the Vaccine Task Force is still supporting phase 3 trials from the commercial sector and asking us to do them. The commercial variant strain vaccines are starting to come online. There's one that's going on elsewhere in the country for the AstraZeneca variant at the moment. We didn't do that in Wessex because we're leading COV boost, which I'll come to in a minute. We've got an ongoing need to look after all our trial participants. This has caused huge problems. We have been, as investigators, nagging the NHS and Department of Health since the beginning of January that deployment has to be fair for people on the vaccine passport, on the trials. It was something that Hancock was taking very seriously and made his personal mission to make sure NHS Digital treated this properly. And he brought up with the G7 and WHO via the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, because the UK policy is that if you're on a trial, whether you're on placebo or active vaccine, you should not be disadvantaged. And so for the UK, all vaccine participants, whatever trial they're on, whatever arm of the study they're on, you can go to the Euros or Wimbledon, and there's paperwork now to back that up. And the NHS app should get a green tick. There are some people who the tech hasn't worked properly, but everybody should have a letter that gives them access. For foreign travel, it's a bit more complicated, because individual countries are making decisions. Even, you saw last week, ridiculous decisions about an identical vaccine being made in India, allegedly not being allowed in some European companies because the Indian manufacturer of the AstraZeneca vaccine hadn't got a license for that through the European Union. I mean, spectacularly stupid political decisions being made by different bodies around the world. But the problem is that that we need sort of global WHO-led sign-ups, that if the people who've been on vaccine trials have done the world a favor, and they deserve to be given ability to travel as anybody who's received a licensed vaccine. And Chris Whitty has argued very, very strongly that the risk of doing that is tiny, and that it will make no difference to public safety or public health for that decision to be an international one. Many of the countries at the G7 agreed with that, but it's not yet over the line internationally, but hopefully it will come. So within the UK at the moment, we've got the National Vaccine Immunisation Evaluation Consortium trials, who've been the NIHR, as we're known, was an existing network of academic vaccine centres, of which we're very much part in Southampton. And we normally, in the real world, in the normal world, we were doing paediatric and infant vaccine trials, but NIHR's been commissioned to do vaccine trials for VTF. There's the COMCOV heterologous prime boost study, so can we use one vaccine and then another, and vice versa. And the results of the first COMCOV came out beginning of last week, showing that you can mix and match vaccines, but actually different combinations do work in a slightly different way. They give you slightly more side effects if you mix the vaccines. But if you take the 2 doses of Oxford AstraZeneca as one schedule, then all of the combinations seem to work and produce vaccine responses at or above that level. We don't yet have all the results from the T-cell immunity or from the 3-month dose interval. So that study also tested 1 and 3-month dose intervals. And it wouldn't be fair to say, well, Pfizer's definitely better than AstraZeneca at this point in time, because of course that can even out when you increase the dose interval that's used between those 2 vaccines, which will we know will increase the ability of the viral vector vaccines to work. So results for COMCOV starting to come out, but look encouraging. COMFLU-COV gave flu vaccines to different flu vaccines to different groups of people in different, one in each arm in April and early May, led by Bristol. And that is also starting to report results, I think this week or next week. JCVI have seen those results now, though they're not in the public domain. And you will have seen that the government felt strongly enough last week to announce a national booster campaign that will be flu in one arm and a COVID vaccine in the other. That was simply to give the NHS time to get ready and to plan the logistics. And the decision was made on the early data from COMFLU-COV, which JCVI have seen. What they haven't done yet is decide which vaccine to use, and that's what we're doing in COV-Boost. We've been running in Southampton with a national lead for an 18-centre a study of 7 different COVID vaccines, and 3 of them at half dose, which finished recruitment last Friday, so 3 days ago. And so we will be doing the blood test for people who've taken part in Cov Boost. I think there were about 480 people in Wessex, Portsmouth, Bournemouth and Southampton who took part in Cov Boost. People have their blood test 28 days after their initial vaccine, and then we will be getting the data for that to JCVI by the end of August so that they can decide which vaccines to use in the autumn programme. And then we have pregnancy, children and people with immune suppressed conditions. So Octave is a study of people with immune suppression being led from Birmingham and UCL and other centres. And they are currently writing Octave Duo, which is a protocol to use a 3rd dose in people with different types of cancer and immunosuppression. It's a very different study with different outcomes to Cov Boost. Can't just do it on one protocol because healthy people's immune systems need to be looked at in a different way to people with immune suppression, where you need to do more detailed immunology in order to understand better what's going on. Pregnancy in children is a slightly more complicated thing because all of the trials were about to get going in pregnancy in children, but then with the clot side effect being noticed, that balance of risk became very different for people under the age of 30. So the pregnancy in children viral vector vaccines from Janssen and Oxford have been paused, not stopped. Children are still being monitored on the studies. The 2nd doses of the Oxford vaccine were allowed to be given despite the clots, because all of the problem with clot is on a 1st dose, not a 2nd dose. And you'll have seen Pfizer have licensed on the basis of an American study their vaccine now, or they've got a regulatory approval, sorry, rather than a license for using the vaccine in the 12 to 15s. But it's a very controversial area as to whether we should immunize children who aren't at risk of serious COVID disease at all, ahead of globally giving the most at risk and vulnerable people their 1st and 2nd doses, or when it comes to boosters and protection against variants, or ahead of people in the UK who are most at risk and their booster. Because of course, if we immunize children, that's going to take up resources that are currently being used within the NHS scheme. And there's a study called PregCov, which is another NIHR study led from St George's, which is going to be studying all of the COVID vaccines that are able to be given to pregnant women in the same way that we're doing in Cov Boost. So it's very important to immunize pregnant women and keep track of the safety and the babies and the immunity that then happens afterwards, because pregnant women are more at risk of severe COVID than non-pregnant women of the same age. You'll have heard also, and some of you will have taken part in the PPI work that led to the live viral challenge trials. And Rob Reed, my colleague in Southampton, is very much part of that investigator group. It might be that as we move forward, that the model of actually young people volunteering to be given COVID, but then be given vaccines before they're given COVID, might be able to accelerate vaccine development, particularly around transmission and the detailed immunology. And this is a UK collaboration involving multiple institutions, but it will be some time before the companies are feeding different vaccines into those trials. When I say some time, in COVID land, that's probably a matter of months, but it's not happening in yet. They're sort of working up the model with the current vaccines rather than new ones at this moment in time. So the key issues, and in summary, are, well, will a 3rd dose be required? Well, maybe, maybe not, but the government have decided that we're going to do it anyway, because we know, as I was telling you before, that we can better protect against variants by increasing the antibody level. And I think there's a no-risk policy being taken by ministers, which is to use a 3rd dose in the autumn in the most vulnerable. So we don't yet know who will be receiving the booster, other than it will be the people in groups 1 to 9 in the same order as before, and the clinically vulnerable. And that is for the reasons I told you before, that increasing people's antibody levels can protect against the variants. And we know that the vaccine will be given at the same visit as the influenza vaccine. Cov Boost is going to tell us which vaccine, and we will be running Cov Boost 2 in August, September, October, where we will be using the different variant strain vaccines as well, and other vaccines at different doses, some of the current vaccines at different doses again, to see what the best thing to do is in the future. And of course, we still haven't answered the question of whether we need to vaccinate children and teenagers to protect adults. Actually, if you look at the data, despite a lot of noise in the public domain that is really uninformed noise, the biggest spikes in transmission are the young adults, is hospitality. And the slightly weird thing at the moment is we're sending all the children home for very, very tiny numbers of positive children, or children who are becoming positive, but far less, if you look at the ONS data, than the young adult 18 to 30 population, where hospitality and socializing is definitely driving the transmission, but not yet hospital admissions. And I guess that's the current government strategy. We will all wait to see what happens as we move forward. So there's an ongoing need for clinical trials of different vaccines and technologies to ensure global supply. We're working on the booster trials and the combination trials for different ages and clinical conditions, and working out how to address the issues caused by mutations. We still have an issue about global manufacturing supply chains. You know, which vaccines do we switch? Do we carry on with Wuhan variant? How are we going to immunize 6 billion people before we really get control globally of the pandemic? And in doing so, we somehow have to, you know, avoid vaccine nationalism and this nonsense that pops up every other week where, you know, vaccine X isn't allowed by country Y. It should make no difference. All the vaccines where they're working, where the trials have been regulated by a regulator of repute. So whether that's the FDA or EMA or the MHRA or the equivalent in Japan or Australia, it shouldn't matter which regulatory body we accept, as long as the WHO see that regulatory body as a bona fide body. We should really be accepting the trial data from around the world. And I think we are in Britain, but other countries don't quite see it that way yet. I will leave it there for the talk and take your questions.